The bell tower of the stone church in Baler shook with every impact. Dust drifted down from the rafters as another volley thudded into the outer walls. Inside, Spanish soldiers crouched behind sandbags and broken pews, rifles braced, eyes fixed on the narrow windows glowing with tropical light. The air smelled of sweat, old incense, and the sour staleness of men who had been trapped far too long. Outside, Filipino troops shouted across the plaza, their calls bouncing off the thick church walls. The Spaniards listened, but didn't move. For them, the war wasn't over. Not yet. The siege had begun in the summer of 1898, when a small Spanish garrison traveled to the remote Philippine town of Baler on the eastern coast of Luzon. The soldiers, barely 50 in number, were sent to protect the area as revolutionary forces pushed to overthrow Spanish rule. At the time, Spain still believed it could smother the uprisings across the archipelago. No one in the garrison expected the mission to last more than a few months. They carried limited supplies, old rifles, and almost no information about what was unfolding across the world. When the men reached Baler in June, they found the town tense and quiet. Filipino revolutionaries were already nearby, watching their movements. The Spanish commander, Captain Enrique de las Morenas, realized they couldn't hold the open town, so he ordered his men into the church of San Luis de Tolosa, a thick-walled structure that doubled as a fortress. They hauled food inside, filled windows with sandbags, and braced the doors. Moments later, Filipino fighters surrounded them, cutting off their connection to the coast. The siege began with rifle fire echoing between the trees. Inside the church, the first weeks passed in a haze of heat, gunpowder, and hunger. The soldiers rationed rice and dried fish, soaked uniforms in water to cool their skin, and slept in brief, uneasy intervals. De las Morenas tried to keep discipline, drilling his men inside the cramped churchyard. He reminded them they were still Spain's representatives in a faraway colony, guarding a flag that had flown for centuries. The men wrote letters home they knew might never be delivered. Outside Baler, history moved faster than the soldiers realized. Across the world in Cuba, Spain signed a peace treaty with the United States that ended the Spanish-American War. Under its terms, Spain ceded the Philippines. By December 1898, Spain no longer ruled the islands at all, but no ship reached Baler, no messenger carried the news into the jungle. The men inside the church kept fighting a war their country had already abandoned. As the siege dragged into its third month, disease crept through the church like a silent enemy. Malaria and beriberi weakened the garrison. Food spoiled in the heat. De las Morenas fell ill, growing thinner and weaker each day until he could barely rise from his cot. Still, he refused to surrender. When he finally died in November, the men buried him in the churchyard under the same earth that had soaked up months of gunfire. Command passed to Lieutenant Saturnino Martin Cerezo, a stubborn officer who believed the only honorable choice was to hold the church until Spain ordered otherwise. Filipino revolutionaries repeatedly tried to tell them the war was over. They shouted it across the plaza, sent written notices, and even arranged for Spanish priests to approach the walls. Cerezo dismissed each attempt as a trick. He believed surrender would stain the honor of the garrison and betray their dead commander. Even as his men weakened, he insisted Spain would send relief once the Navy regrouped. He clung to every rumor and discounted anything that came from Filipino hands. The revolutionaries grew frustrated. They respected the garrison's courage but couldn't understand why the men kept fighting. They increased pressure on the church, digging trenches closer to the walls, firing volleys to break the defenders' will, and blocking every possible escape route. The Spaniards answered with their own volleys, firing from narrow windows where sunlight cut through the shadows. By early 1899, the church looked battered and sunken, like a stone shipwreck lodged in the jungle. Moss clung to the walls. Trees along the edges of the plaza had been stripped by months of gunfire. Inside, Spanish soldiers were gaunt, exhausted, and hollow-eyed. Rats ran openly among the pews. Supplies were nearly gone. Still, Cerezo refused to surrender. In February, the Filipinos delivered another document claiming Spain had lost the war. Cerezo tossed it aside. He said it looked forged. He demanded proof written in Spain's own newspapers. The revolutionaries sent those next, actual Spanish papers, but Cerezo insisted they were falsified or printed under duress. To him, the idea of Spain abandoning the Philippines without a fight was unthinkable. And so the siege continued. The turning point came months later when a Spanish officer named Colonel Aguilar arrived in Manila under American oversight. He confirmed publicly that Spain had surrendered the Philippines and urged all Spanish holdouts to lay down their arms. Filipino leaders sent a messenger carrying Aguilar's statement directly to Baler. Cerezo examined the document with a careful, almost painful suspicion. This paper carried official seals. It matched the style and language used by Spain's military offices. For the first time, he hesitated. Still, he wasn't satisfied. He asked for the name of a specific officer he knew personally in Manila, someone who could verify the truth. Days later, the revolutionaries sent a letter signed by that very man. Only then did Cerezo accept what he had spent months refusing to believe. Spain no longer ruled the Philippines, and his men had been fighting for a ghost of an empire that had already collapsed. On June 2nd, 1899, after 337 days of siege, Lieutenant Cerezo ordered his men to prepare for surrender. The garrison, reduced to barely 30 survivors, stepped out of the church carrying rifles so worn they looked ready to fall apart. They expected humiliation or imprisonment. Instead, Filipino commander Teodorico Luna greeted them with respect. He called them brave soldiers who had defended their post with extraordinary determination. He allowed them to retain their weapons and escorted them safely to Manila. The march out of Baler was quiet. The soldiers passed the plaza where so many volleys had been exchanged, the trenches dug by Filipino fighters, the graves of their own dead. Behind them, the church of San Luis de Tolosa stood scarred but still intact, a monument to nearly a year of resistance born from loyalty, pride, and a deep refusal to believe the world had changed without them. When the survivors finally boarded ships bound for Spain, they returned not as defeated men, but as symbols of endurance. The Spanish government later honored them as heroes. For the Filipinos, the siege became a strange chapter, an example of courage wrapped inside the final collapse of colonial rule. It was a siege fought in isolation by men holding tight to the last threads of an empire already erased by the tides of war. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.